This is a really different kind of project. It's not my typical cup of tea. I hope it won't seem like ancient history to most of you. It doesn't have an argument, it doesn't have a theoretical framework. It's more kind of a historical narrative, a peek behind the scenes into the lives of two US classicists, whom I hope you've heard of. You'll know more by the end of the lecture. So I have to go back, though, to the mid-1930s, as Hitler was rising to power, and increasing numbers of Jewish intellectuals from Germany and Austria were trying to get out, whether to England or Canada, United States, anywhere. And obviously the crisis had been brewing since April 1933, when the Nazi regime had passed the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, the restoration, right, which resulted in the firing or forced retirement of all Jewish academics. And then after the annexation of Austria in 1938, and the devastation of Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, there were more and more waves of increasingly desperate Jewish academics trying to get out. And so I'm talking today about one particular path taken by a subset of this refugee population, that is the Jews who managed to emigrate to Britain, some after having escaped Nazi concentration camps in Germany, but who were nevertheless interned as enemy aliens during the early part of the war. And these internment camps were established by the British government, first in England and then subsequently in Canada and Australia. I looked again on the National Archives website, and they term Canada and Australia as the colonies and the dominions. I love that phrase. So some individuals managed to find sponsors and move on with their lives, but others were caught in a nightmare bureaucracy that kept them behind barbed wire for years. So today I'm focusing on the internment experience in Canada. By the end of July 1940, over 4,000 German and Austrian internees had been deported, sent across the Atlantic and imprisoned in makeshift camps in Canada's eastern provinces. And among this group was a really high proportion, almost half of were teenagers and young men under the age of 25. Two young German refugees who befriended one another while interned in Canada were Martin Ostwald, born in 1922, and my father, Thomas Rosenmeyer, born in 1920. And both of them eventually earned their doctorates in the US. They became successful professors of classics, and they stayed lifelong friends. And I'm just focusing on this shared experience of internment at a critical moment in their intellectual and emotional development, and arguing that it had a huge impact, whether positive or negative, on their lives and professional careers. So in May of 1939, Rosenmeyer received permission to leave Germany and was admitted to the UK. He began studies in Sanskrit just around the corner at SOAS, but then SOAS was evacuated to Cambridge not long after. The next interruption came in May of 1940 when, on Churchill's orders to, quote, collar the lot, end quote, German Jewish men and boys were rounded up and arrested as enemy aliens. And I don't know how well this history is known in the UK. In the US, right, we know about the Japanese internment, but I think this is a chapter of history that still isn't that well known. So many of them were held temporarily in makeshift camps in England, including Bury St. Edmunds, a town near Liverpool that I don't know how to pronounce. The Isle of Man. In fact, Rosenmeyer's father was also held temporarily on the Isle of Man. That is my grandfather, before being shipped off to internment elsewhere. And so it would be over 2 years before Rosenmeyer regained his freedom. And that was in 1942. He was sponsored by a local Canadian Jewish family. He was released and allowed to complete his education. BA in Classics from McMaster in Ontario, MA from Toronto in 1945, PhD from Harvard in 1949, and he wrote his dissertation on Plato's Atlantis myth and was mentored by fellow emigre Werner Jaeger. Ostwald was 2 years younger, and so he escaped Germany on a Kindertransport to England, but he too was eventually arrested and sent to Canada. He didn't have his high school degree yet, so his Abitur, so he was working towards his high school certificate in camp, but was also obliged to work, and he helped the war effort by making camouflage netting for tanks and socks for Canadian soldiers. He was lucky enough to be sponsored by a Jewish fraternity that arranged for him and a few others to enroll at the University of Toronto, which was the place to be in Canada on the East Coast. He got his BA in classics from Toronto in 46, his master's from Chicago in 48. You can see there's still sort of this impulse to get to the States from Canada. On his PhD from Columbia in 52, he wrote his dissertation on the Athenian Constitution under the supervision of fellow German emigre Kurt von Fritz. So we could piece together what life was like for Oswald and Rosenmeyer in the camps because of some personal letters, some memoirs, some diaries that we're lucky enough to have. Oswald was 18 when he was interned, Rosenmeyer was 20, and both men had benefited from a traditional sort of humanistic education in Germany, but neither had really clear plans for the future. Oswald wanted to become a classics scholar, but anti-Semitic legislation got in the way, right? He couldn't go to German university, so he was contemplating training as a rabbi before his departure for England. Rosenmeyer wasn't sure whether he could continue his studies abroad. I mean, nobody knew what was going to happen, and so many of those who knew they could get out or had some sponsorship learned new trades. So at various points, as he prepared for as he hoped to get permission to leave, he trained to become a shop window dresser, as well as a piano tuner. And he acknowledged much later that, quote, for years after, I carried my tuning fork with me in the vain hope that someday the collective pianos of my new community would be crying out for my services. None of the things I did to prepare myself for my impending life as an immigrant ever proved useful. Quote. So my main goal today is to explore how classics worked in the lives of these two men, how they turned to classics, how classical learning might have comforted them, inspired them. Did they eventually become professional classicists because of this wartime experience? Did they just fall back on what they'd been trained to do as high school students? So we have a little bit of an insight into that from Martin Ostwald in this article from 2002. He wrote, my personal experiences show me how human beings are capable not only of degrading and dehumanizing themselves and their fellow men, but also that people have the potential to achieve greatness by creating monuments in art, literature, philosophy, and social justice that constitute the values of civilized life. In my case, the Greeks have shown the way. Sorry for you Latinists out there. And it's their heritage that I've tried to pass on to my students. In contrast, Rosenmeyer really resisted connecting his wartime experience to his vocation, his personal experiences. When asked directly, why did you choose to teach classics, he answered that it was preferable to washing dishes for a living. Could never get anything more serious out of him than that. But for both men, internment changed the direction of their lives. It obviously saved them from the horrors of staying in Germany, in concentration camps, but it also set them on a trajectory that they might not otherwise have chosen. They really had no choice. And so I'm going to start by talking just a little bit about their education, and then moving on to their life as internees, and the sort of, you know, what did classics have to do with these camps, which were internment camps, prisoner of war camps, not death camps in any way. Just a very side note, a little side note, not to be rude about it. Maybe I will be rude about it, even though it does have to do with Crash. Sorry, Simon. But there has been work on the Jewish refugee experience, right? There's a book recently out on the Arc of Civilization, Refugee Scholars in Oxford University. It's 2017. There's a conference in 2020 on Cambridge as a city of refuge, with this wonderful quotation at the bottom there: the British rescue of scholars and scientists in the 1930s and 1940s rightly belongs among the most inspiring chapters in modern academic history. Well, that works if you're Arnaldo Mobiliano or Edward Frenkel, right? But it doesn't work for these young men. And I'll say, mention later, they're just some amazing minds in these camps. So if you were already established, not always, but if you were already established, you could be warmly received. What I'm looking at, in contrast, explores refugees in limbo who are just really suspended between their old and new lives, and they just have no idea where they will live, what will happen to them. And I want to see how they acted and what they did in these sometimes up to 2 years of limbo, and how they created a sense of normalcy inside the camp, which would then help them once they got outside. So both these men came from comfortable upper middle class families. Oswald's father was practicing as a lawyer. Rosenmeyer's father was co-owner of a small banking house. So they were expected to attend humanistic high schools with a strong emphasis on classical languages and literature. So typical German gymnasium, you may already all know this, right? 8 years of Latin, 6 years of French, 5 years of Greek, math and science, 2 optional years of Hebrew, 3 optional years of English, and then, world history, music, physical education, all those other things. Standard entrance age was 10. The students graduated at 18. So Rosenmeyer began his studies in 1930, he was 10, at the Johanneum, or the Gelehrtenschule des Johanneums. It was Hamburg's oldest school, founded in 1529, a friend of Martin Luther's. He got his high school degree in 1938. It was one of the last graduating classes that had Jews in it. In fact, this high school class was pushed to graduate a year early so the students could go into the officer corps for the German army. Rosenmeyer did not take biblical Hebrew in high school, although it was offered for those who were going to become Protestant ministers. I was just reading some additional notes where he said that he didn't take French or Hebrew because it met at 7 in the morning. And I can sympathize. But elsewhere he says he didn't take biblical Hebrew because he wanted to take modern Hebrew. And he did that privately. And his reasons for learning Hebrew were because he was going through a phase when he was 15 where he felt he had to re-identify as a Jew. And he rather unfortunately decided he would be a militant Zionist, a follower of Jabotinsky, and conquer Palestine with a gun over his shoulder, right? So for 2 years, he studied modern Hebrew, and then he says, my disenchantment with Zionism, not even Hebrew, came swiftly and showed the flimsiness of my commitment. I'd helped to earn money for the movement by participating in exhibition boxing bouts. To defend myself against Nazi goons, I'd learned how to box. And one day, my usual opponent called in sick, and the promoters put me up against a man 40 pounds heavier. I was beaten to a pulp, and my Jewish revisionism died an abrupt death. On the other hand, Ostwald started a school at age 6 in a Jewish elementary school, the Jüdische Volksschule, in his home city of Dortmund. And he began to learn classical Hebrew, not quite as rebellious, in 2nd grade. In 1932, though, his father, who was really fond of Greek and Latin, wanted him to go to a gymnasium where he could learn Greek and Latin. So he went to the second oldest gymnasium in Westphalia, founded in 1543. I'm just checking because I hadn't really thought about it. 4 years younger than the Hamburg Johanneum. Anyway, in spite of some bullying, it was the same case with Rosenmeyer. They seemed to all take boxing lessons. So Ostwald took boxing lessons from a former German lightweight champion, and apparently the boys stayed away after that. Ostwald enjoyed his time there, starting Latin at age 10, Greek at 13, and for an American audience, that's a lot more surprising. I think for a British audience, maybe starting that early isn't so surprising. Ostwald's father wanted him to switch to a Jewish high school in Frankfurt, but Ostwald didn't. And he convinced his father, and this is what he writes in his memoirs. I was grateful that I was able to stay at the gymnasium, for once we started reading Homer, I knew that I was hooked on Greek for life. As a matter of fact, I was so hooked that I read more than double our daily assignment and kept on reading Homer in bed at night, switching the light on again. That's partly why I took my title, put my title as After Lights Out, switching the light on again after my parents had switched it off. But I was far from imagining that I should ever be able to go to university to study classics. So he was hooked on Greek and Latin, but he also was very involved in social clubs, in Jewish clubs that offered social and cultural events, hiking clubs, lecture clubs, poetry readings, and so forth. And some of the things that he was doing then, these sort of clubs that offered sort of Jewish entertainment or engagement, I think may have inspired the internees later. They recreated in the camps both educational opportunities, but also cultural opportunities. But everything came to an end for the boys on Kristallnacht. Ostwald, his brother Ernst, and his father were arrested and sent to the concentration camp Sachsenhausen near Berlin. The boys were released after 3 weeks. If you had a bit of money, if you had connections, you could get out in the early days. This was quite early, 1938. So the boys were released and scheduled to leave in December on a Kindertransport that their mother had hastily arranged for them. But Ostwald writes this about his memoirs. His father died in Theresienstadt and his mother in Auschwitz-Birkenau quite a few years later. So this is when the boys leave Sachsenhausen. Papa was still in camp, wasn't released until a few days after we'd already left. He was rounded up later. We last saw him on December 3rd, the day we were released. He blessed us, and among his last words to us were a Greek quote from Homer's Iliad, in which Hector tells his wife Andromache, "The day will come when sacred Troy will perish, Priam himself and the people of Prime of the Ashen Spear." He evidently foresaw the end of his once beloved Germany. So it must have been incredibly poignant, but it's also very, very telling to me. Anyone to hear, for Oswald to hear his father turn to Homer for what would be his final words to his children, right? So the blessing was in Hebrew, but the farewell was in Homeric Greek. So Oswald and Rosemary arrived in an England that was increasingly worried about the German invasion, and once Germany crossed into Holland and Belgium in May 1940, the same day Churchill became prime minister, the government began putting into motion its plans for the internment of male German and Austrian nationals between the ages of 16 and 60, living in strategic areas on the southern and eastern coasts. After the defeat at Dunkirk, the orders expanded to include women, and there were various categories, A, B, and C, of how dangerous you might possibly be. A was to be interned immediately. B, they could remain at liberty subject to certain restrictions, such as a 5-mile traveling limit and the surrender of cameras and bicycles. My mother was in that category. C, for those exempt from internment and all restrictions, usually older or very young. But these distinctions soon disappeared in the general panic, and by the end of June 1940, some 30,000 internees of all categories were being held in makeshift facilities. And the problem was there was no way to tell if you're German speaking, if you're a Nazi sympathizer, or if you're a Jew. And the British just couldn't deal with that, right? So simply color the lot, in Churchill's words. And we get this wonderful statement in the Isle of Man Examiner, that just under a key stake action, it says, "There is only one place for the enemy alien while the war lasts, and that place is behind barbed wire." What I find really fascinating is that most of these internees didn't, they were not angry. They didn't resent this. They kept their intellectual interests alive, and they were grateful in a way, to be out of Germany. There were amazing minds in these camps, and they immediately started sort of teaching one another. Ostwald was arrested while he was up in Bournemouth. Or is it down? Down in Bournemouth. Oops, excuse me. Working in a kosher hotel. So he was arrested and sent to the Isle of Man. And again, there's absolutely no bitterness in his description. He actually says it was the most comfortable place in which to be interned. A lovely view of the sea, he says. But what's most interesting to me, obviously, is that we had a lively intellectual life with many interesting people in the camp giving lectures. Professor Ernst Neustadt, who had been teaching at a gymnasium in Berlin, had brought with him a volume of Greek lyric poetry, and a small circle of us enjoyed it, and his commentary on the poems. I figured out that this is actually Neustadt's own collection that he put together of lyric poems. Neustadt is very sad, and he ends up trying to teach at a boys' school, and then he commits suicide in England after his wife dies. And anyway, there's some very sad stories. Although these camps were not, they were not death camps, many people did die of illness or of despair, really, during that time. But the Isle of Man was insufficient for housing this growing number of refugees, and so that's when the British request politely let Canada and Australia take these internees off their hands. Just the most dangerous elements, that is, all single males between the age of 18 and 40. It's getting more and more insulting for those of us who are older. We were not. Yeah, okay, so 18 and 40. And also, Oswald was sent from Ireland to Glasgow, and then he left on July 4th. It took 10 days before he landed safely in Quebec City. Rosenmeyer's arrest was a little more complicated, right? So he got a British certificate of registration on May 20th, 1939. I think I'm going sort of from left to right, if you want to follow along. And there are notes on November 7th, 1939, April 20th, 1940, that he's a refugee from Nazi oppression, and the holder of the certificate is to remain exempted until further notice from internment and from the special restrictions applicable. So basically, this document was valid until it wasn't, and I can't seem to get a hold of the document. I'm still hoping at the National Archives, what order it was and what sort of stamp then comes that says, no, you are no longer exempt. But when they got to the camps, a quotation from his friend Erich Koch, who would later work for the Canadian Broadcasting Company, he said, in the camp, right, near Varus and Edmonds, we were not allowed radios or newspapers. Devastating. However, lectures started right away. So, and another internee says, there's so many professors and lecturers among the internees that a camp university is open. So Rosemar was able to send a few letters to his parents. He tells them he's still with his Cambridge companions. In another letter, he says, food's very good. The officers are nice. He says, I teach Latin and Greek, learn Sanskrit and Arabic. I hear lots of lectures. I'm as comfortable as possible and work as much as in Cambridge. So this letter shows that with the postcard that they were still able, families were still able to send food and supplies. He writes here about the writing paper. This is the first sheet, he says, and I'm afraid I'll have to start a diary to make use of all that plenty. And that's the diary I'll turn to soon. I think it's the same paper. But he was also then sent in July 1940 on a different ship, and he arrived 10 days later. His mother received official notification, right? They were allowed to then send notification that they arrived safely. And this is important if you know anything about some of the other ships that went across. The Arendora Star that went a day earlier was torpedoed by German U-boats, and since these enemy aliens were all behind barbed wire in the bow of the ship, most of them do not survive. The Nazi and officers and who had been captured, and the German seamen, the professional sailors, they were up on the upper decks. Okay, life in camp. So they're distributed in camps in Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick. Some camps are better run than others. It really depends on your commanding officer. Camp N, which is where Rosenmeyer was in the town of Sherbrooke, had a particularly vicious sergeant major. A military observer noted strictness arbitrarily applied, rude and appalling language, and indulgence in anti-Semitic remarks. And the setting was equally awful. You can kind of see on that right-hand side. I didn't notice how light the lights are. Can people see the slides well enough? Okay, sorry. So on the right-hand side, you can see it's this huge building. And so here's a description of the inside. It's an old railway engine repair shed. No divisions, just this huge shed. And so here's a description which explains how awful it is. It's really dirty. There were 6 old-fashioned lavatories without ventilation, 2 urinals, 7 water taps. We're talking about 736 internees in that building. Windows are broken, roofs are leaky, and then these are enemy aliens. They're not prisoners of war. So Geneva Conventions do not apply yet. Later on they will. Floor space allotted to each amounted to 29 square feet, contrary to the British Ministry of Health regulations, which required a minimum of 35. So it's a pretty awful place. And the internees were immediately put to work building things, right? Building latrines, building bed bunks and things. And, but the camp was never what one would call comfortable. Prisoners were paid pennies an hour. I already mentioned the fishing. No, I didn't mention fishing nets. I meant camouflage nets. There were also fishing nets and socks on a sock machine that one worker described as a medieval torture apparatus. In his diary, Rosenmeyer writes of lots of petty humiliations at the hands of the guards. The guards were kind of borrowed from World War I veteran troops. You can see they had fixed bayonets. They didn't know what to do with these internees. But there's a general misery, right? Just not knowing what would happen when they'd be released. There's a camp artist in N. We don't know the name. I think the first name we know is Renee, but we're not sure. Anyway, there's some really wonderful drawings, and I will show you some more of those. All the prisoners wore shirts, uniforms, with large red circles on the back, so they could be easily targeted if they attempted to escape. As one sympathetic inspector wrote on the right-hand side there, the uniform an internee is required to wear is both degrading and unworthy of a civilization that believes in encouraging the individual rather than treading on his soul. It was disturbing to find distinguished university professors dressed as clowns. So in spite of these horrible conditions, actually, no, I want to show you a couple of the slides, right? So here's one where, again, this is this artist Renee, that's all we know. And you have the barbed wire, and you have the uniform, and this idea that, if only we could get out, and where can you go? It's harder to cross the Atlantic again, although some did go back to England. They're desperately trying to get out, and America is sort of the promised land. And if you note that barbed wire, this is material courtesy of Eric Koch. He actually saved a piece of that barbed wire from Camp N, and they all managed to keep their sense of humor. And this is later, but he said, this is a piece of barbed wire that guarded us, that prevented us from escaping. Nobody ever tried to escape. What would we have done anyway? Right? These camps were pretty much in the middle of nowhere. There was one in New Brunswick where all the internees had to work as lumberjacks. And when you think of, these young men and boys who were not exactly physically fit specimens, just, anyway. I'll move ahead though now to the slide and talk more about the universities and the education. So Oswald needed to finish high school, and he and others tried to set up a situation in which they could get their high school degree. So they got some syllabi from local supporters. They got some textbooks. They set up their own school. There were enough people to teach them. Many of the young men had multiple roles, and so Martin Oswald was not only learning, not only one of the candidates, and as well as a teacher, but also became assistant principal of the school. He was studying Latin, Greek, English literature. He had his own students. He was his own, I'll do it in first person. I was my own only student in Greek with some help from Tom Rosenmeyer, and then he invited anybody else who knew anything about English literature to give lectures. Just to give you a quick sort of rundown, by September 1941, right, they'd been there since July 1940 now. 27 young men were trying to do the junior matriculation class, 14 in senior matriculation, which would be high school diploma. Classes in engineering, there was vocational training. These weren't all brilliant intellectuals, right? So there was woodworking, metalwork, there was a musical circle. Evening lectures were attended by approximately 140 men per week. Sherbrooke had two future Nobel Prize winners in chemistry, Max Perutz and Walter Kohn. 2 economists, 5 lawyers, 1 professor of art history, another professor of international relations, 8 medical doctors, a dentist, and 2 rabbis who were well trained in the history of religion and Semitic languages. So there was a lot of formal education, but there was also informal education that I find most fascinating, just the collaborative effort so they could all learn together. It wasn't easy. Hear the words of an art historian, William Heckscher, who talked about trying to study, and remember, it's this huge engine repair shed. The fight for a tolerable atmosphere in which a vita contemplativa can prosper requires about 50% of your alertness. Rooms set aside for silence are an exception. There's usually a canteen or a kitchen or a piano, which intrudes into your Lebensraum, which is a wonderful joke on the whole Nazi idea of Lebensraum. Private study, in the sense a student outside would understand it, simply doesn't exist. I have in 18 months of internment not had a single minute which I might have called my own. Vast areas of thought I had to shelve until the day of my liberation. Boethius couldn't have written his consolation in a modern internment camp, and Dante at best might have made copious notes. So it wasn't easy. Coincidentally, Rosemeyer also mentions Boethius and Dante in his diary, and so I give you an image here. There are 19 loose pages covering 7 weeks of early 1941, written on both sides of the page, right? Paper was scarce, in blue pen, in small cursive English. You would not be writing in German at this point. You notice that postcard to his mother, who was in London, was also in English. Occasional words written in Sanskrit, Arabic, Greek, Latin, German, Italian, and Hebrew, and a few drawings of a different generation. And the diary really documents the informal education. And for Rosemeyer, the two most important people he learned from were Otto Demos and Emil Fackenheim. And before I leave this picture, this book he's reading is, this is dated either 41 or later. And he already managed to get library books from McGill. This is a Sanskrit book that he's reading, and I have the title of it, teaching himself. So these two men were really important. One was an art historian and Byzantinist, Otto Demos. He later went back to Austria and was part of Austria's newly organized Federal Monuments Department. Falkenhayn was closer to Rosemeyer's age. He practiced briefly as a Reform rabbi, but then became a prominent philosopher of the Shoah. So I can't cover all the examples in the diary forever, and I'm trying to keep an eye on the time. And I do want to remind you that this is still a camp, and that's hard to read, but those are all the hours of reveille, roll call, inspection, time to eat, and so it's still. So reveille at 6 a.m., lights out at 10, work parties in between. And the diary tells us about arrests for smuggling in tobacco, smuggling out letters, talking back to a guard, those guards with their fixed bayonets, right? So, it's not that easy. But Rosemeyer did manage to read really widely, and I'll jump ahead, just a little bit, to sort of give you a sense of some of these diary entries. I mean, he managed to read, and it's not written here, but he was reading Dante, Schopenhauer, Chaucer, and Machiavelli. The longer they stayed, the more they were able to get books from the outside. And in his second year, internees were redefined as refugees, so some restrictions were lifted. He has Latin classes. With Fackenheim, he read Arabic, Hebrew, Plato, Tibullus, Boethius. With Demos, he discussed Byzantine icons, Panofsky's theories, because Demos had studied with Panofsky, Etruscan architecture. He began learning Italian, and then he also taught at the same time. So to me, I'm quite amazed by, when I think about what we did, the Alpine Duel? No, what are you commenting on?
Bruckner. Can't remember any of his melodies.
To me, that is the saddest. Just to think that you knew you loved it and you couldn't remember. But when I think about how I've behaved during COVID lockdown, I can't say I've been worrying about the Alpine Duel. And that's all I can compare to this, right? If you're stuck somewhere, what do you do? And they just did these amazing things. You can get a few hints. This is, my father's list is not Martin Oswald's list, who's still a poor guy doing high school curricula, but there's some hints here about his future interests, right? He was cheered up immensely by ancient and modern philosophy in that first one. He was interested in philology of, Chi versus CH, the Alpine dual I love. At the bottom, we talk about the elements which make up a piece of literature, the criteria for its criticism. You can see little bits of his interest in philosophy and philology. So one bit that's perhaps the most classics focused. I mean, the whole talk is classics focused, but one bit I do want to talk about is a poem that Rosenmeyer and Ostwald wrote together in camp, because of course they brought with them the skills of prose and verse composition. Ostwald came to Sherbrooke in January of 42, so we can date this a bit. And they put their heads together to write a poem about their Latin teacher, Mr. Hermann. It's very hard to trace Mr. Right? Mr. Hermann. So I haven't figured out who he is, but he did go back to England afterwards, I think. And he had a teaching certificate in Cambridge, so at some point I'll have to track him down. So he appears in the diary without much detail. Here we have more detail, and it's not easy to read. So what I've done is I've sort of split it into 3 parts. But I'm happy to give it anyone who wants the whole poem. But I split it into 3 parts. So, and that typescript was done later, right? And so that's my father's handwriting on the top saying Martin Ostwald and Tom Rosenmeyer written in internment camp and in camp. I don't quite know what they wrote it on, or in fact, did they perform it? Did they, what did they do with it? Was it like sized out? Did they sort of send it around and hide it from the guards? I don't know. And none of this was something my father discussed with me while he was still alive. These are all documents that I found later that his mother had preserved. So, as is often the case, right? You don't ask when you have time to ask. So, all right. So this poem opens, in full Hesiotic voice. A question to the Pierian muses: for whom should we sing our song? But the options turn out to be very much sort of the new world. He says, should we sing to the English for magnificent Canada or the red-skinned natives? And I have to do a little side note here because if you're German, you might know about Karl May, but you might have to be of a certain generation. You're too young, probably, right?
I do know him.
You do know. Okay, good. So Karl May, that's all Germans knew about North America and the indigenous peoples, right? The Canadian First Nations. They knew the novels of Karl May, who lived from 1842 to 1912, and he was incredibly popular. He wrote for children, he wrote for adults, and these books starred noble Native American heroes, and the stories were so popular that the Nazis never banned them, even though they were, idealizing non-Aryans. Everybody had to have access to their Karl May. So I'm not apologizing. I'm just saying it was a different context, I think. So they decide that the most deserving addressee is their own camp teacher, Mr. Hermann, who taught them a less than cheerful crowd classical literature. And then the poem switches sort of in mock epic style to a series of similes. And if anyone has any suggestions, I have a feeling there are lots of sources here. We're not quite sure what they were working with, whether it was Gradus ad Parnassum, right, that sort of handbook for composition, whether it was what they were reading. Anyway, I've had suggestions of Tibalas and Livy and various other things. So I haven't really done a philological exploration of this poem. I'm not sure I want to, but if anyone has ideas, it's great. So just as a huge elephant terrifies audiences in the arena, so their teacher terrifies them with his scolding. Lines 9 through 10, the numbering goes with the Latin side. They're somewhat obscure, but they continue the imagery of a savage animal, focusing on their teacher's face, his mouth, as he berates them. And we get this reference to his unruly dark hair and his head is shaking. Definitely this teacher has lost his temper with his students. Oops. Okay. And then we continue with the similes: a savage lion, a volcano, right? The fiery mountain pours out rocks with a stammering sound, and then we fall silent. So he's terrifying the lazy ones. lots of bitter words. He's raging again. I hope you're not feeling that way as you're marking papers these days, but slightly more than halfway through the poem, he calms down and he offers his students refreshments as a reward, which isn't a bad tactic, you know, in an internment camp where the food is probably scarce and not so good. So they allude cleverly to black water at, where is that line? Aqua Nigra. I'm still looking for it, sorry. Oh no, it's the next slide. Excuse me, no wonder it's not there. He prepares a feast. Pleasant reward for well-taught minds with cakes and black water. Aqua Nigra in line 20. Which is basically cafe and kuchen, right? So he's offering them coffee and cake, sort of cozy continental German tradition at the end of the lesson. And then the final 4 lines of the poem are again somewhat obscure, but we can kind of assume children should love books. Britain should be spared a Nazi invasion. I'm not sure whether slingshots would really have done it, but there you go. And Hermann is worthy of aid from Neptune and Thetis. And I think the last part is saying, may he have a safe voyage over the sea back to England where he can be employed. So as I said, I don't really know how this was, you know, if it was performed. They did a lot of performance, or if it was read. I have to admit, with the help of Jim Zetzel, I've just been advised, and I realized myself, that they really played fast and loose with a lot of quantities here, with meats and liquids at the end of the pentameter, and other odd syntax, right? There's a mirabile dictum at one point at the top of 11 there, where we'd expect mirabile dictu, you know. But hey, they were young, right? So this is the poem that they wrote behind barbed. So they wrote this jointly in the first half of 1942. By August of that year, Oswald passed his high school exams. He was released from Sherbrooke under the sponsorship of a Jewish fraternity, and he enrolled in Toronto. A little bit of a pushback from the Board of Governors, and call it here, because, you know, why should these enemy aliens take the place of good Canadian boys who are overseas fighting? But they managed to get in. And here's Oswald's description of his schedule, pretty good. All the things I read. He does acknowledge that prose comp was the most useful class he took. But they do all the greats, right? Homer, and they seem, I don't quite know how they decided what to do when, but they covered a great deal of material. Rosemary was not so lucky in his timing or in the outcome. So Oswald's out in August 42. Rosemary couldn't, he was very frustrated. He watched his peers getting out, just go ahead already, and he just kept writing appeals, which didn't go anywhere. So in April 42, he was told that the immigration authorities made it a condition that he be registered at a university before he could be released. And this is what he says. He says, I used to do Greek philosophy with Fackenheim. He's now at Toronto, and he visited the professor of classics on my behalf. I didn't look up, sorry, to see who that was. I sent some papers to that prof, and he wrote me a charming letter. And, you know, he thinks he's going to make it work. He's going to do everything in his power, but it's up to the university. And 3 months later, he writes again that classics had accepted him, he was approved and recommended by the committee of the faculty, but the Board of Governors turned him down. And he says there's no explanation given, and he assumes correctly it would seem that anti-Semitism played a role in the decision. He mentioned an unofficial numerus clausus. And at this point, he's just tired and says, you know, I really wanted to do Sanskrit and modern Indian languages, and Tarrant is the only place I could do that. His language is a bit odd. Expect to find live Indians in an Oriental library, but again, this is 1942. And so then he says, you know, if someone, it's not up to me. If my friends decide to send me somewhere else, I don't feel strong enough any longer to make my own decisions. I shall have to revise my plans. And he did have to revise his plans. So in his case, he really wanted to do Sanskrit and Indian languages, but because he couldn't get into Toronto, he went to McMaster, where he did classics. Managed to do the degree in 2 years, probably because of all the education they'd done in camp for 2 years. Ostwald, I'll stop with the sort of life after camp. Ostwald is typically cheerful. I think I'd have to say Martin was always cheerful and optimistic. My father was a bit more of a cynic, less emotional. So Ostwald says from 44 to 45, the best part was I had two, my two good friends from internment camp were still there. Tom Rosenmeyer was beginning his graduate studies, his MA, and then Emil Fattenheim was taking his PhD, so it sort of comes full circle. So I'll conclude. I've sort of taken you through not a long, 10 years, right, from 1939 to 1949, rather tumultuous years, in which Martin Ostwald and Tom Rosenmeyer went from being German gymnasium boys to refugees in Canadian internment camps, and finally to successful graduate students in prestigious classics departments in the US. It's hard to draw kind of neat conclusions about their motivations. I mean, they both loved ancient languages, more Sanskrit, they were Greek and Latin. They felt themselves to be part of an intellectual history that was extending far back into the classical past. And they have amazing overlaps actually in their curriculum vitae, which I hadn't really known until I put them side by side, although I was there in Greece playing with Martin Ostwald's son David, so I did know that, but I didn't sort of see how much else they did together. I don't know if that was intentional or if it just happened. So they were the best of friends for 65 years, and they had slightly different intellectual goals, right? Rosenmeyer had this budding interest in Sanskrit. He also, after his time with Jabotinsky, he was fascinated by pacifist views, and particularly Gandhi and Nehru. And actually, one of the reasons he was interned was when you came to the UK, you were asked, would you be willing to fight for the British Army? And his younger brother did. But at that time, after his Jabotinsky phase, my father was a pacifist. And so he said no, and then ended up in internment. But he started at SOAS, he wasn't at Cambridge or Oxford, he'd hoped to continue the studies, but got caught up in red tape. And so classics was the second choice for him. But I do think that the comp lit aspect probably came out of that, right? That he had a broader sense of things, and so do classics and also comparative literature. But Sherbrooke prepared him well for that, as you saw from that list of after lights out interests. But Ostwald was always certain of his true intellectual home, briefly derailed, thinking about becoming a rabbi, but always loved classics. And whether his father nurtured that idea, he just fell in love with it, or whether it also was from the camp. And so his last words here, right, looking back on my school years, he says, I think it's by and large true that the most humane teachers I had were those who taught Latin and Greek. That may be one of the reasons for my love of classics. Could it be that it was their devotion to the classics that made them more humane than the rest? So this sort of powerful idea of classics as a passport to humaneness, still a powerful idea in our time of our contemporary cultural conflicts and ongoing refugee crises, especially coming from this man who personally experienced one of the most inhumane and soul-crushing periods in modern history. So I'll leave you with some suggestions for further reading, non-fictional on the left, fictional on the right, and I really thank you for coming and for your kind attention. Thanks very much.